our speaker today is Camille Utterback. I've known Camille for a number of years. We met, I think, right after she graduated from, there's been a very, very cool art and technology program at New York University, the NYU ITP, Interactive Telecommunications Program. And I think that over the last quarter century, that place has been the powerhouse of thinking about the aesthetic experience of computing in the physical world. You know, it was really inspirational to me. When I started doing research, that was right when they were getting started. And a lot of cool stuff has come out of that group. Among other things, Foursquare was founded by an alumni of that program. A lot of cool stuff, a lot of cool researchers, a bunch of neat ideas. And Camille had the good sense to move west. And she's been working on physical art installations for a number of different years, or a number of years. You've been at Stanford for about 5 or 6 years now?
Yeah, starting my 6th.
Cool. And I think it's a really interesting department. And I'm trying to think of what things I can say that don't touch on her work, because she's going to tell you all about her work. And I feel bad mentioning people's famous awards, but it is worth it. So Camille, among many other awards, is a bona fide MacArthur genius. And I remember I got to help celebrate with her the day that she got her MacArthur Award, which is the same day that Manisha Agrawala, who's another good friend of our group's, got the award. And so that was really cool to see. And so Camille is, I think, one of the first people who I often hold up as an example of, here's somebody whose fundamental commitment is to the art world and who is completely unafraid of and, in fact, enthusiastic about using technology to tackle that. And so, I think a lot of us here are like, yeah, of course those two things go together, but historically that wasn't always the case. And Camille is one of the pioneers showing it is.
Thank you, Scott. So thank you guys so much for coming, and thanks for the invitation. I looked at the list of previous speakers, and it's very humbling and an honor to be included with the likes of some of my heroes as well as colleagues. So excited to be here. As Scott was saying, I come at this as an artist, although I have at times, like when I was at ITP, I wasn't sure what I was doing. My undergrad degree's in art. I was really interested in design. So I think you could make an argument I kind of go back and forth between those things, but for sure the context I've been showing my work in has been art, and that it's like galleries and museums, and a very lot of public art commissions and site-specific pieces that I've developed for a specific location that were going to be seen as artworks that people interact with. So I have the luxury, which some of you maybe don't have, that nobody is quantifying my human-computer interfaces and checking, are they being used in the way that you thought they were going to be used. But it's very important to me that those interfaces are clear to people. So I think if you're making artwork that you claim is interactive, which most of mine is, and people don't understand that interactivity, then you're basically failing, or you're making a conceptual artwork. You're not making a work that is experientially interactive. So I'll talk a little bit about that, some of my design choices as I present my work. But also, an issue that I have as an artist making interactive work is, how do I avoid making it a kind of one-liner, right? Like, if the only thing that is in the interaction is clear, is that something that you just enjoy for a little bit and then you're not interested anymore, right? Because we think of great artworks, or at least interesting artworks, as ones you want to come back to over and over again, and there's something more for you as you live with them or engage with them over your lifetime, hopefully. So I also think about a lot, how do I make interfaces that are also complex enough to retain your interest over time? And so I'm going to talk about I'm going to group my work into 3 questions for you guys that I want you to think about around interaction design. And I'd also like to frame that with an even bigger question, which is, what are the metaphors that we're using in our interfaces, and how does that give you a sense of who you are as an actor in the world? So what is the story around your agency in those interfaces? Because I think now there's it's very easy to look at Facebook and say, oh, they weren't thinking about the implications or the ethics of their interface design. But I think that we all are kind of lacking in that. And I'm more and more increasingly concerned about the idea that what we look for in interface design I wrote these down to be sure I didn't forget, is that you're always in control, right? That you are the center of the universe and all interaction is frictionless, right? And so if you think about those things as like a model, a narrative model for the world, it's a kind of scary world because the real world, you are not always in control. You are definitely not the center of the universe, and many interactions are not frictionless. So I think if we're looking at those as kind of narrative models of how we think about ourselves, there's a lot we could do differently. So I'm going to start with one of my earliest works that used a camera as an interface, which I did develop at ITP, the program that Scott was talking about. It's called TextRain. It was done with a fellow grad student, Romy Ashetiv, so it's a collaborative work. And I'm just going to show a quick video. This is really old video, so bear with its quality. And the audio starts a little bit in. .320 by 240 video capture.
TextRain is a playful interactive installation that blurs the boundary between the familiar and the magical. Participants in the TextRain installation use the familiar instrument of their bodies to do what seems magical, to lift and play with falling letters that do not really exist. Like rain or snow, the colored text appears to land on participants' heads and arms. The text responds to the participants' motions and can be caught, lifted, and then let fall again. The falling text will land on anything darker than a certain threshold and fall whenever that obstacle is removed. If a participant accumulates enough letters along their outstretched arms or along the silhouette of any dark object, they can sometimes catch a word or even a phrase. The falling letters are not random, but form lines of a poem about bodies and language.
So this is the poem text that's falling, which is a poem by Evan Zimroth. Gave us permission to use it, actually. So this piece taught me so much about interaction design. And just quickly to touch on that idea of clarity to complexity, anyone who stands in front of this piece sees themselves immediately. And at the time when we did this, actually, projection technology was not very common. So the first thing people were just like, whoa, why am I on that screen? Like, what's going on? How did I get there? They slowly start to realize, oh, there's these letters, they're in color, it's a little hard to see in that video, and they can start catching them. And then after a little while, they start realizing, oh, there's some words in here, like maybe there's a poem, and maybe they figure out how to catch lines with a poem or start to read it, and maybe they don't. And over time, I was surprised that people kept telling me they read things in this that weren't there. But if you catch some letters from one word and some letters from another word, you can actually start forming new words that aren't even in that poem. And then there's obviously the social interaction that people start having as well. So there is a complexity that kind of continues, even with this really, really simple rule set. So I and Romy, who were developing this, we're not doing any complex computer vision. There's no figuring out your skeleton. There's no analyzing any gestures. It's just working with light and dark. So it's a very dumb kind of computer vision system. But I think a lot about now with the amazing tools we have in computer vision, how in a strange way, even though they're more sophisticated, they've really dumbed down our bodies, or they've at least normalized our bodies into this thing that has 4 arms and can move in different ways. But like if you're bald, or if you have an afro, or if you're fat, or if you're thin, doesn't matter. So I think one of my first questions is, how might our designs respond to the subtlety and individuality of our human bodies? So obviously, if you're making algorithms, you have to make some assumptions, but what are you leaving out in those algorithms? I'm not sure if they've fixed this, but some of the skeleton tracking systems wouldn't count you as a person if you didn't have 2 arms. Another part about the social interaction is I often had to fight really hard to get the camera in the middle of the screen, like with galleries and stuff. That's expensive and hard. You might have to build a wall and drill a hole. But if the camera was up on the top of the wall, it's looking down at your head, and you can't make eye contact with the other people in the space through the camera. So anyone who used like Skype and things like that, you have this weird thing where you're trying to look at the camera and then make eye contact with people. So those design decisions I think are really important in terms of how people feel in the work and then what can transpire because of that. So I got really excited about doing pieces that use cameras because of all those ideas. I guess, and also at that time, VR was really big in the 90s. This is kind of before we got excited about the internet. So the camera systems, like TextRain, for me, I talked about it often as having ambient interactivity, which is sort of funny now, but the idea that you could be kind of involved in the piece, but also doing something else and also talking to the person next to you. You didn't have to put on a head-mounted display. So we're back at that issue, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. So, but I wanted to make more of these systems because I found them really compelling. And I started doing ones after exploring a lot of frontal systems where the camera was looking at you head-on, systems where it was looking down at you, so kind of more of a bird's eye view, because that gives a very different kind of spatial information. But it has a problem, and then people don't know exactly where they are, right? There wasn't the affordance of seeing yourself like as in a mirror, which we're very familiar with. So I started innovating on how to mark the floor in a way that people would understand something is different about this part of the floor, and that's when I'm in the piece or out of the piece. I failed a lot. There were times when before I figured out these theater lights that could make a nice crisp square that matched the projection. My biggest fail was it was a gallery there. They didn't want me to put tape on the floor or mark the floor or paint the floor in any way, which I was sometimes doing. I put down like a thin kind of plastic mat. And so what did people start doing? Right? Because I was giving them this cue that the mat was the sensor, and so they thought that was what was reacting to them. So they started jumping harder and harder and harder, and I was really sad because the camera was having this much more fluid interaction with you. So I'm going to show you just stills of some of these and then video of a much more recent one. So this is external measures from 2003. It's a little hard to see, but I didn't know how to load in textures. I was slowly teaching myself more and more about programming, but I was trying to get a kind of richness in the imagery. And eventually got better able to load in different kinds of things that would be manipulated based on how people were moving. Untitled 5, Untitled 6. This was the first and only time I got to show, wow, the screen's a little dark here, 3 pieces all at once. And it was so instructive to me to watch the external measures 2003 is constantly moving, and these two, you will start activating elements when you walk into the area, but then they come to a point of stillness when you're not there. How differently that I assume, or I am believing that those behaviors change people's behaviors in front of the pieces. The one on the far left, people were like kind of aggro and jumping in and out all the time, right? Because whatever happened in the imagery because of their movements was constantly being written over. So it was like you were constantly being erased or reabsorbed, and so they wanted to like put themselves back into the work. Whereas these are actually very beautiful when they stop. So this is a still from Untitled 5. And it was like this, you had to then break this threshold by walking into the space where you would disturb the image that was already created. So I've started thinking a lot, or it was very important to me to start thinking about how the behaviors that I code into these systems really do change people's behavior and how they tune themselves to that behavior, right? If we're in a room with kids jumping around going crazy, we either join them or we try to stop them. But we're as humans really attuned to the group dynamic that's happening, and I think our interactive systems are part of that dynamic. So part of this Untitled 5 system was the first time I really felt I also completely comprehended how to craft a whole bunch of different rules to make an interesting piece, right? So I think in interaction design, we often think of one rule that's happening or things that are happening sequentially, like I use this tool and then I use that tool, not like how are a whole bunch of behaviors, can those coexist in the system? So this would react to stillness. If you stood still, there were parts that were really legible so you could see yourself or find yourself, but then things I think you will never figure out how they're working unless I explain them to you, right? So that was also part of how I was solving the clarity to complexity. And again, I'll show you a video of a current piece. Sometimes people ask, because I'm coming from my undergrad degree is in fine art, like is there such a thing as the artist's hand in programming, right? Like we talk about that with painters, you can recognize a painting by someone because of their physicality and their sensibility, like how they actually make the paint strokes. A good art historian will recognize that right away. And I wasn't really sure about that until this fell out of a notebook. And this was a drawing I had done probably 5 years before that last piece. And I hadn't done much in between because that was when I was learning how to program and had kind of stopped painting. So I think that answers the question. So this is a piece that's actually up right now in Washington, D.C. if you're at the National Portrait Gallery. So I just finished it this year. It went up in May. It has the same scenario with a lit area on the floor and the camera looking down. Actually, and this is, I think, worth noting too, I got in a little bit of a, well, I had a difference of opinion with the head designer who wanted it to be a little blurry. See how much more blurry it is? And guess what? Like a few weeks after the show had been up, they called me and said, some people like aren't understanding like that they need to go into that lit area. And so they unfortunately they decided to put some text that isn't in this picture that says, please step into the lit area to interact with the piece. But I am pretty sure it's because it's blurry instead of sharp. And that is enough. We're that subtle in the way we understand, that a crisp square has a different kind of meaning than a blurred square. So I'm still prototyping this idea. So here's just another shot of the piece with me in it. It's for a show called Blackout, Silhouettes Then and Now. So the Portrait Gallery has a really big collection of these silhouette cutouts, which were super duper popular right before photography. So you would sit in front of a scrim, basically, with being lit from behind or the other side. Someone would trace you, and there was a mechanical apparatus that would take the tracing and transfer it in a smaller, mechanically shrink that, and trace it on a piece of paper that then you would have a bunch of pieces of papers like snowflakes and cut out. Someone would cut that. So you would get a whole bunch of copies of your face, which was amazing when you had no other way other than hiring an oil painter or someone to get that image of your family and friends. So the curator asked me to be in this, and I was like, I don't understand. There's 4 contemporary artists in the show. And she said, well, you're taking, you're extracting people's silhouettes out of this live camera image, which I was like, oh, I am doing that. Of course, I'm extracting outlines all the time. And she said, it's also there's a sort of performative social aspect to what you're doing, where people are watching that process and engaging with each other around it, which is very much what happened around these cutouts for silhouettes. So I was excited to be in the show then, and actually made a new piece for it. So I don't know how well easy it is to see, but I'm going to talk about some of these different elements of the piece. So when you walk in, so this is the capture of the screen. When you walk in, there's this kind of lighter area where your body is. So I hope that's how you find yourself and kind of figure out, like, oh, there's a camera here tracking me somehow. And you are being traced by, I don't know how easy it is for you guys to see, there's a really fine black line that's kind of zooming around your outline all the time. So I was referencing this kind of tracing and cutting of the historic silhouettes. But then something really different happens where that line starts turning into material, these dots, and then eventually bigger dots, and then eventually colored pieces that become part of the composition. And then as you can see, when someone else comes in, they can push those around. So the background is really the result of someone being there, their silhouette turning into dots, and someone else or you pushing them around. So I was kind of interested in the idea, again, we're so sort of self-centered right now in this idea of like I'm me and this is my kind of coherent identity. I was interested in could this piece kind of show a sense of self that became a shared space, right? So my silhouette really becomes the material and the space that you're a part of. So we're kind of co-creating that. Another part of what happens, I don't know if you saw, is when you leave, your silhouette is grabbed, and that works as kind of negative space. So it blanks out an area of the screen. And over time, this is the first time I've actually stored all that information, not just within the course of the day, but it actually saves out a file at the end. So the file is really big right now of all the people who have left, and it will play those back when nobody's in the space. And the little pieces will drift to it. So because this space was really a cul-de-sac, like you can look in from the hallway, I was sort of concerned that people might just look in and see, oh, there's like a still projection with nothing going on. So this is the first time I've made a kind of, the piece has movement when nobody's there in order for you to recognize it's not just a still projection on the wall. That's just another still. So obviously camera input gives you this kind of richness about people's bodies, and perhaps you can create these intersections of them in an interesting way. I've also gone the opposite direction of what is a really low bandwidth kind of information about people's bodies. So this is a piece called Aurora, Oregon, which is in a suburb of Minneapolis, where I was trying to figure out if all the data I had was you touching a hand railing, off, on, and the time duration of that, could I create an interesting interaction that built up a history of the place. So in the same way that Precarious, which is the video piece I just showed, the past is impacting that interface in the present. I was interested in doing that here as well. So the idea was it's almost kind of like Morse code. Oops, you have to click. So the short or the quickness or length of you touching the hand railing determines the kind of length of stripes of color in each of these hanging LED pieces. So, and it was important to me too in this space, I was trying to get people to look at each other across this mezzanine. They originally wanted me to do a video piece on that gray background, but I thought, well, everyone's just gonna be looking at the wall in this super tall space. It was much more interesting. Everyone's like coming up the escalator here to create an interaction around that. So I'm not sure, I really thought that kind of sense of touching, you could capture that and replay it in the space. I think it might have worked better actually in retrospect if it was on the hand railing, because there's a little bit of a disconnect there between touching the hand railing and having it be visualized in the tubes. But again, happy to talk more about that later. So first question was about how can you represent the subtlety of our bodies and the differences in our bodies in these spaces? My next question is, how might our designs convey a deeper and more specific history, or deeper and more specific histories? Right, so some of that's already coming out in this idea of, I think a lot of our interfaces are ahistoric in the sense that nothing that happened before is present in them now. They don't get dirty. They don't get like dog-eared the way a book does when lots of people read them. Like they have no trace of their use, other than maybe your police's data about how they've been used, but they're not very good at visualizing a kind of sense of time. So in addition to these layering up of histories in visual space, I've actually gotten into like looking at archival materials, because computers are really good at holding lots and lots of imagery of the past. So this is a piece called Shifting Time San Jose that was in the San Jose airport for a number of years. I'll just play a video of this. Another way to try to mark the floor, constantly experimenting with that. So the camera's overhead again, and the closer you are to the imagery, you're moving through frames of this historic video and also frames of a contemporary video that I've lined up with it. Ambient interactivity, again, it's in an airport. People don't have to engage with it for it to create some kind of effect or something interesting. There's lots more video of all these pieces on my website as well. So the piece had 20 different pairs of historic and contemporary film, video, and current video. So in some cases, I actually could find the place up in the corner of that yellow building is that building in the past, in the 1900s. And sometimes it was more just conceptual pairing, so transportation, trains in the past and present, how we got around. A flea market and a current flea market and a past kind of market that people would go to. And my favorite ones were pairings of gestures, right? So these are women sorting fruit. San Jose was a super, had a lot of orchards, and now it's high-tech, women programming at Cisco. So their hand gestures are very similar. So I was interested again in how, what comparisons of imagery can tell us about ourselves in a way that words can't. Not all my work is interactive. This is a piece called Span from 2011, which is in the Fort Point, which is a historic Civil War fort that's under the Golden Gate Bridge. Sorry, I didn't have a picture of that. This is like one of the cannon battalions, so you could stick your cannons out there and fire at ships in the San Francisco Bay, which never happened, thankfully. So there's 8 monitors in these kind of boxes. And each of them is visualizing a section of the 2 shorelines that the Golden Gate Bridge spans. So each of those is one of those boxes. And what I did was collect, I forget how many, but many, many maps, starting with hand-drawn maps, aerial maps, really intense or high-res current satellite maps of each of these areas, and lined them all up. and algorithmically animated between them. So this kind of undulation, which to me was representing the shoreline, will pull in 3 different areas from any of those different maps and kind of blur them, or merge them together. My hypothesis was that the shoreline would have changed. So this was for the 75th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. I forgot to say that. But my hypothesis was the shoreline would have changed in that duration of time. They actually built the bridge on the most solid rock, so the shoreline didn't really change at all. But what changed is how that shoreline was depicted, and in particular the technologies of how that was represented. So I got very interested in comparing, what matters to people in these different maps. But any map is a shorthand, right, for the real world. So at certain times, video of those actual shorelines kind of comes in and disrupts everything. And this piece was also something that starts blending into the last question I'll raise about materiality. Because I had to protect these screens from the salt water, which is basically coming in the cannon bay, like the open window there, I had to build like sort of protective cases. And I thought, well, maybe I can use that top to indicate where the bridge is, because the bridge isn't in all of the maps. And I like the idea that it would have sort of a ghostly presence there that came and went in the animations. But that started me thinking a lot about that for the future. So here's the 2 boxes where the bridge actually spans across in the maps. And that's actually the bridge spanning you in the space. Like it was lined up. I very carefully lined it up with the bridge that hops over the fort. The reason that the fort survived the building of the bridge is that the engineers of the bridge refused to knock it down, which is what they were supposed to do according to the government who was commissioning the bridge. But they thought that it was such a great example of Civil War architecture that they designed the bridge around it. So I again encourage us to think about what are we failing to respect and incorporate into our current designs in terms of history. So this is another piece, really recent, well, sort of recent, 2016 that I did for the San Jose Museum of Art and History. It's called Vital Current, Seeking the San Lorenzo. The San Lorenzo River is why Santa Cruz, my bad. I get the saints a little confused in California. Santa Cruz is where it is, and the San Lorenzo River is right outside these windows. And the Museum of Art and History has a really big archive of all kinds of photographs. And I thought it would be interesting to draw attention to the river. There's a long history of it being kind of hidden behind walls because of the flooding that occurred. So the piece consists of a touchscreen interface to this 3 projection kind of shaped, it's on vinyl in the Windows projection. And this is a really bad video, but just so you understand the connection, when you touch the kiosk, someone will come in a minute, and you touch on the kiosk, pulls historic footage into the river animation. And it's a touchscreen that can handle about 60 touches. So this footage is me very methodically swiping. But in parties, there would be a sort of ruckus of people touching it in different imagery. And on the kiosk is just the date and a little bit about the imagery that's being pulled. So you actually have to look up into the windows to see what's going on. I think this is a video too. So I shot this live footage of the river, which is really interesting. I think because you can see out the windows and like cars are going by and people are going by and you can see birds. People kept assuming this was live, which is sort of mysterious to me, but I got questions over and over again, oh, that's live at the river right now, isn't it? And I think, again, because the river really is behind this building outside the windows, there's a sense of it being connected into the environment in a different way than if I had had a square screen and if you couldn't see through the windows. So I'm increasingly interested, too, in how screens exist in our physical world. Are they obliterating our physical reality? Are they causing us not to look at each other or look at the world around us? Or are they helping us make new connections to those spaces or provide additional information about them? I worked with a programmer Mary Frank in Touch Designer to do this piece, and she really encouraged me to build a tool, or she built this tool, which was super helpful. So the photos were scanned at super high resolution, but then I had to pick sections of them that would make sense in this complex window structure. So it was very easy to move around. You can see that these little guys are just a tiny, tiny part of that image, and then you had to get them in a place where you could see them between the lattices. So I'm also interested in how do we build tools as artists that help us create our work. And this is just a close-up, so you can see. Because everything was at such high resolution, you could actually see like the grains on the paper in the photography or in the old postcards, which were part of it. So I think that also is part of like how I'm more and more suspicious of our screens as kind of equalizing everything in their materiality. And I love this little section. So there were huge floods in the river, but I like how the ducks can kind of swim in with the cars from the 1920s. And originally this was supposed to be a camera tracking piece, but that did not make sense with the way the museum used the lobby and the kinds of events that took place there. So I was sort of skeptical if it would be a shared space in the way that some of the other computer vision pieces are, but it was fairly effective, I think, because you had to look up at the screen, so it wasn't like you could sort of dominate the interface aspect of it. I'm going to talk about one more piece that is, for me, thinking about specific histories and how our interfaces can bring those into a space or reflect on them. This was not a piece that I didn't get to do, but a proposal for Fort Mason in San Francisco, which is a historic military base. This is it in the 1930s, I think. It was known as the point of embarkation, because 1,647,174 people departed from here to foreign wars, or wars we were in. So I was thinking about that military history, but in particular this idea of like leaving on an incredible journey that you may or may not come back from. And now it's an art center, right? So there's how is that military history, what is the connection between that and artwork? And how could I create a kind of marker for that space? So the idea was to create 3 flagpoles that have a flag, but these are kind of strange flags. I was thinking of them more as like portals rather than staking territory. So flags tend to stake out territory and create division or boundaries. What if that instead was an opening for possibility? So they would have a presence in the day where you could see through to the sky. And the images on them, I wanted them to be abstract, but they're basically lifeboats from the ships. So that would be a rendering of it in the day. But then at night, this is a kind of strange part of town. It doesn't feel very nice to walk around there at night, so I wanted to bring some life into the space. So the idea was to put projectors that would aim at each of the flags, so that at night there was a projection. And these were just prototypes of what you can see my string. This is a mock-up in my studio. Pay no attention to the fishing wire. I couldn't get a good fan to do this. The idea was that there would be, I would have prototyped more of the images and the videos that were on them. But again, how does this flag invert to a space of possibility with the projection of water onto it? And this is really getting into my current interest about prototyping different kinds of screens as well. Like why are we stuck with these flat glass things? I don't want to give up on digital imagery and being able to animate and change the imagery, but I'm tired of those flat surfaces. I also think there's an important way where this is reacting to the physical space in the weather that's there, right? So if it's windy, these are going to look really different than if it's not. And that was the idea at night, that they would kind of be a beacon for this art space. So the third question is, how might our designs incorporate a richer materiality and then again become parts of the spaces they're located in? And I think that does apply to our phones too. If you think about how, like, again, we use them to kind of not be in the place we're in. So I'm curious if we can do better than that. So this again is a proposal I didn't do, but it is ideas I think are important. Creating an installation out of transparent LCD screens, which all our LCD screens actually are, but these were actually marketed for a while as products you could get without the backlight and casing. and that it is hard to see on this, but the idea is that there are animations on, video animations on these screens that change based on whether a person or two people or no people are standing near them, which I'm not going to get into that very much, but I want to show you the prototype. So this was a screen, I think, produced by Samsung that I tested. And what's interesting to me about it is it's a full color screen, but if you use it as black and white, the black is opaque and the white is more translucent, so the sun shines through it. Sorry, this is a little cringy video. But I was thinking about how that could basically be used as a way to let the light and my animations be part of the physical space. So the client who requested this proposal kept saying, oh, we want like a big LED screen on this corner. And I was like, like it's a busy corner, like you need people to be able to walk through it, first of all, and it's kind of sad to just block off, what is happening in this space. So the idea was that the sun moving through these, the shadows from the animations would also become part of the surface of the sidewalk that was around here. So this was a light study just to kind of think about that. If you look at this rendering now too, I was trying to imagine what those, full frame HD video animations would look like on the sidewalk. How to work at night too. So I also proposed how to edge light it so you could actually see them at night. And this piece, they didn't select me to do this one, but asked me to do a project inside their building. And I convinced them to let me do these pieces on glass, which came from a lot of other problems I was having as a new media artist trying to do permanent commissions. And like for a long time, New York City, you had to guarantee your work for, I think, like 60 years. I was on the hook that it wouldn't fall apart. And I'm just like, no computers that I know of right now will last for 60 years, which is a whole other problem. But how can I create a hybrid space that has the materiality that might last and has this overlay that might not last? So my contract for this piece is that, there's 3 projectors and camera tracking in the hallway, but a whole bunch of double layers of custom glass that I made. So the agreement is that if they choose not to maintain the interactive and projected part, they can have the piece as the glass. So that seems like a bit of a compromise that might work out. So you can see the 3 projectors. There's 3 Connect cameras in the ceiling. And through a lot of testing, I realized that having a double layer of glass provided the most interesting surface, which I'll show you a video of this too, but this is just to show it at different times. Also, it's bright in this hallway in the day. Like, people think projectors are miraculous and can compete with the sun, but they can't. So there's some times of the day when you're really looking at the glass and other times when you can see the projections on top of the glass. So daytime, it has one presence. Some days you can really see the projections and some days you can't. So I'll talk more about this after the video, but notice how the brown of the tree, the projection coming through it, cast a brown shadow on the wall. So it was actually very confusing to people what was the projection and what was shadows of the colored glass. This has, hopefully you can read it, I'm just going to let you read. I did this with Michelle Higa-Fox, who is Slanted Studios, who made this video. This was done in Touch Designer also. So we know where all the opaque areas are in each panel from that photography we did of it. And in the idea of having different kinds of behaviors, some of these behaviors are much more like triggers, like some of the ink swaths that grow when you walk by, and some are much more generative, like the leaves are always appear in different places, and they are big, they only grow when someone walks by. So the tree gets more and more leaves over time, and then eventually they'll blow away. I only figured out through testing with Franz Meyer, who was the glass fabricator, how interesting those sandblasted areas would look when you projected white light, because they make the light in projectors is in line, so you get it's coming through a lens, so you get super black shadow or dark shadows on the wall of the sandblasting. So there's kind of an inversion between the white of the sandblasting and the dark. So this got me excited about working in glass, which is the last part of this talk, is how might our designs more engage with the materiality of our world, which maybe I already said. But I've started trying to learn more about glass blowing and kiln cast glass, and thinking about, could that provide a way to make projection surfaces that are that take account at the very least of our binocular vision and what we can perceive about the world. So if you look at someone next to you, look at their shirt, and think about what you can see about the texture of that fabric, and then think about your phone screen and what is lacking there, is something that I'm trying to get to here. So this is a series of hand-blown glass. I had a residency at Pilchuck Glass Studio near Seattle. Worked with an amazing glass blower, Dante Marioni, who helped me do these. And then this is not super high tech. It's just in After Effects projection mapped very painstakingly, so that the video is only hitting the opaque chips inside these pieces. So here's a little video of that. But what it really looks like is that the video is trapped inside of the glass, almost like amber. Sorry, this projection's a little dark. So there's 3 projectors around the table, so that in each object, the light could also be coming from 3 different directions and hitting the opaque pieces inside. But you really believe that the light is inside these objects. I encourage you to look at this on my website, where you can see it a little better. Although it's interesting to me that it's very hard to document these things that take more advantage of our stereo vision. They really don't come out very well in photography, which smushes them back into 2D. So I did some other kiln cast pieces where the projectors are integrated into the objects. This is one up close. Again, what you can't see is that the green light is actually, these are about an inch thick, an inch forward of the light that's in the back, and there's light catching on different surfaces in between. So it's actually a display with layers in it. And so that brings me to the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is I did a residency at Bullseye Glass, which is based in Portland but has different resource centers around. There's one near me in San Francisco. It's in the East Bay where I live. So I was really trying to get a handle on how can I create these different layers in glass to combine with digital animation. So this is powdered glass that you can work like with a paintbrush. And then those layers fired, and then I was thinking about how to combine those and how that worked with light. So I just was doing a lot of testing of like what happens with different kind of pigments depending on what kind of animations you put behind it. And then layering them up and firing them so that that block has like 5 different layers in it. Here's just another example. I worked out I wanted more space in them. I had to deal with bubbles. It's really interesting to learn a craft technique like this. So I just have one example of a really test animation behind this piece. But I mean, you can see the kind of richness of that object. And then what happens when it's in combination with light coming from behind it. So I'm still kind of figuring out, do I want to project onto things or bring light through? There's pros and cons to each of those. But I'm hoping to really continue exploring in this vein. The pieces I'm working on now, which I don't have video of, the animations are starting to be in color. So I scanned all of the layers before firing them the last time. So it's pretty interesting to combine an image of the image itself with the glass and sort of what starts happening. So I think that's it. I'm starting to work on some bigger ones of these. And again, just to get a sense of like the richness in the detail in these handmade pieces of glass. So again, what is missing in our other interfaces? Can we think about that more and build things that really take advantage of the richness of what we can perceive? So here's just the recap of my questions. How might our designs respond to the subtlety and individuality of human bodies? How might they convey deeper and more specific histories? And how might they incorporate a richer materiality? So I'm excited to hear your questions. Thank you, guys.